and gentlemen, the next press conference is presentation of a new UN report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, and I give the floor to Ms. Fiona Frazer, head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to present our new quarterly report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, which covers, as you can see, the period from the 16th of May 2018 to the 15th of August 2018. This week will end with the International Day of Peace on the 21st of September. Its global theme this year is the right to peace, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 70. As the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said, lasting peace and security can never be achieved in any country without respect for human rights. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, where fighting continues in the east, where daily lives of hundreds of thousands are disrupted by shelling, by restrictions to freedom of movement, and by limited access to economic and social rights, where detainees suffer in pretrial detention for months, up to years, and where violent attacks against targeted minorities and hamper the freedom of expression, there appears no end in sight to the conflict. This would seem not a reason to celebrate the Day of Peace, and yet, more than ever, there is a need to call for peace and to call on all parties to the conflict to implement the specific recommendations I will focus on today in this statement. From the 16th of May to the 15th of August, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission documented 105 civilian casualties, 12 deaths, and 93 injuries. This is a 30% increase from the last reporting period. If we compare the data to the same period of 2017, this is a 37% decrease. This confirms that the conduct of hostility remains unpredictable, different every day, forcing civilians to live in constant anxiety and insecurity. Moreover, in the 5th year of the conflict, there is still no comprehensive state policy providing compensation and reparation to civilian victims, either for the death of a relative, for conflict-related injuries, or for damage and destruction to property. Such a mechanism has to be established. So what caused the civilian casualties over the reporting period? Shelling, as you can see from this image, caused 50% of civilian casualties. The majority of fatal incidents occurred from mid-May through June, until the harvest ceasefire went into effect on the 1st of July. The following months, July and August, saw a lull in the hostilities. Even when there is no or less shelling, the levels of landmines and explosive remnants of war contamination are extreme. The breakdown of the causes of civilian casualties confirms that 40% of civilian casualties that we documented in the reporting period were caused by the handling of explosive remnants of war, mostly hand grenades, as well as landmine incidents. Most tragic in these figures are the children killed and hurt due to this lethal litter of war. This July, in the armed group-controlled Horlivka, a boy handling a hand grenade was injured, along with his brother and grandmother, when it exploded. In Verno-Turecke, my colleagues spoke to children at the beginning of the school year, and I'd like us now to listen to what they have to say.
Я с ним гуляюсь, ну и иногда стреляют. Нам страшно иногда.
И что происходит, когда их стреляют?
Мы идем домой и целый день можем не выходить
Да.
на улицу. Пули, гранаты, лимонки.
А вы знаете, как они выглядят?
Да. Если ты пошел в лес, увидел мину, нельзя трогать. Надо или позвать родителей, или позвонить на 101.
This July and August, we again saw how a recommitment to the ceasefire does result in reducing civilian casualties. Every time when a ceasefire recommitment takes hold, even for a few days or weeks, it saves lives and spares people from life-altering injuries. Yet, the Easter ceasefire, the harvest ceasefire, the school ceasefire, these always end up being only temporary band-aid solutions. People need an end to the conflict, and we reiterate that the Minsk agreements are right now the only option on the table to achieve an end to the conflict. People living in the conflict zone bear both burdens, that of the indirect violence and also the chronic long-term consequences of the ongoing hostilities. Crossing the contact line is one of them. It still takes time, many hours, money, and physical effort to go to places which used to be, at best, only an hour away. In this reporting period, the total number of crossings increased by 5,000 per day, reaching around 1,200,000 crossings per month. We welcome the long-awaited draft resolution of the Ministry of Defence regulating freedom of movement across the contact line. And we encourage the Ministry to take on board the suggestions that we, along with other international partners, provided to the draft resolution, as this should ease the crossing of the contact line for thousands of people. This reporting period saw another round of the suspension of pensions for people from the conflict zone. From April to June, almost 100,000 people lost access to their pensions caused by undue restrictions. We welcome the decision of the Supreme Court made on the 4th of September. It confirmed the verification requirement previously introduced by the Cabinet of Ministers does not constitute lawful ground for termination of a pension payment. It thus reaffirmed as unlawful the decision of the pension fund to suspend a pension based on verification results, including house checks. We hope this decision will lead to a national policy to ensure the payment of pensions to all Ukrainian citizens, no matter where they reside. But even more so, we reiterate that the whole procedure must be changed and the right to one's pension must be delinked from the requirement to register as an internally displaced person. During the reporting period, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission documented 63 human rights violations and abuses, such as arbitrary detention, incommunicado detention, torture and ill treatment, sexual violence, and threats to physical integrity, committed on both sides of the contact line. In government-controlled territory, we continue to have access to official places of detention and conducted confidential interviews with 64 conflict-related detainees, 56 men and 8 women, in 7 cities and 2 penal colonies. In contrast, in territory controlled by the armed groups, we continue to be denied confidential access to detainees despite requests. Such denial reaffirms our concerns about the condition of detention and treatment of detainees. Though an uncomfortable issue, and at times graphic and sensitive, I would like to quote a man who told us how he was tortured in Luhansk. During the first 2 days of detention, I was severely beaten, forced to stand on my toes while my wrists were handcuffed to the ceiling and subjected to electroshock whilst tied to a table. Similar practices are applied on both sides of the contact line, reflecting that this is a systemic human rights violation predating the conflict. In government-controlled territory, we are concerned that investigations into allegations of arbitrary detention and torture are predominantly ineffective. Our recommendation in this regard has not changed over the years. The Office of the Prosecutor General and law enforcement agencies must ensure effective investigation into allegations of torture, ill treatment, arbitrary detention, and enforced disappearance. On a positive note, we welcome the Parliament's adoption on the 12th of July of the Law on Missing Persons, which aims at supporting the families of the disappeared and criminalises enforced disappearance under national legislation. We are now looking forward to seeing the swift implementation of this law. Violations of fair trial rights persist, including continued intimidation and pressure on judges in conflict-related cases. Coupled with ineffective investigations that I have already mentioned, this leads to an environment of impunity, when perpetrators of crimes are not held responsible and victims are deprived of justice. In this reporting period, 60% of decisions made by Ukrainian courts in criminal cases related to the armed conflict were based on a plea bargain agreement. We are concerned that in some cases, defendants may have been forced to plead guilty. We therefore strongly recommend that judges carefully review all plea bargain agreements and refuse to accept any guilty plea where there are reasonable grounds to believe that a person was under pressure, including through the use of torture and ill treatment. Finally, we can report some progress in the investigation of killings at Maidan in 2014 and the 2nd of May 2014 violence in Odessa. As for Maidan, a court in Kiev allowed for the reopening of the investigation into the killing of a journalist in Kiev on the 18th of February 2014, having revoked a decision previously made by the prosecutor's office to close the case. In Odessa, indictments were filed against former senior police officers related to the violence in the city centre on the 2nd of May that resulted in the deaths of 6 people. In territory controlled by the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic, people remain affected by the parallel structures of the so-called administration of justice. The report explains how these structures leave some individuals at risk of indefinite detention. Of further concern is that people accused of links with the Ukrainian military are tried in closed sessions, and in some cases, lawyers assigned to defend conflict-related case detainees perform their functions on a pro forma basis, not knowing the charges their client face or the stage of the proceedings. In this reporting period, we saw brutal attacks on journalists and civic activists. In one fatal case, an environmental activist was found hanged from a tree in his hometown in Kharkiv region. In Kherson, acid was thrown on a female senior staff of the city council known for her anti-corruption views. In total, we documented 45 violations related to fundamental freedoms the right to non-discrimination and equal protection under the law. Some incidents were directly perpetrated by police officers. In some, police officers were present and did not act appropriately. And at least 8 attacks on media professionals, activists, lawyers, and minority representatives were perpetrated by extreme right-wing groups, often with impunity. The period under review saw an increase in attacks against Roma. My colleagues visited a Roma settlement in Uzhhorod region and talked to the widow of a Roma man killed in an attack in Lviv.
Рукав, да?
Да. Рукав так, руку. Тоже дома я тут сидели і так я ножик увидела, я боюся.
We echo the voice of civil society and our international partners and urge the prosecutor's office and the police to conduct swift, effective, and transparent investigations into all the attacks. In armed group controlled territory, we observe little or no space for dissent and for enjoyment of fundamental freedoms. We continue to observe the use of arrests and the developments of new regulations to stifle critical voices and limit those few remaining opportunities for peaceful assemblies or for functioning of religious organizations. As parents of one detainee told us, we are constantly afraid to say something that may be used against us. We are paranoid to talk in public about anything sensitive. Terrifying times. As you may know, last week we launched our second thematic report on the human rights situation in Crimea as mandated by the UN General Assembly. Copies of the report are available at the entrance. But let me reiterate the 2 messages from this report. The Russian Federation continues to disregard its international obligations as an occupying power in Crimea. And the second, Ukraine, despite having no effective control over the peninsula, retains its human rights obligations towards those who live in Crimea. Looking to the future, 2 inevitable things are upon us. First, winter is coming, and as conflict continues, winter will bring additional hardships for civilians in the conflict zone. We encourage authorities at all levels to undertake actions to improve the protection of civilians affected by the armed conflict. And second, The country is moving towards the official start of the election campaign. During this time, the increased frequency and gravity of violence threatening civic space is particularly worrying. We expect a clear message from the government of Ukraine that it will not tolerate impunity. The message should come in the form of swift investigations leading to accountability and justice. I thank you very much for your attention. I encourage you to read the report in full, which you'll find at the back, and I look forward to any questions.
Колеги, якщо маєте запитання, прошу.
If you have any questions, you are welcome, colleagues.
Can you compare, please, the situation with the past years? And as we know, the conflict is about 5 years. And did the situation has changed critically or not?
Thank you very much for your question. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has been here now since March 2014. We came to support the government of Ukraine in addressing systemic human rights violations, and in particular to support activities undertaken to look at accountability and ensure that there is justice for victims and perpetrators are held to account. We have monitored, documented, analyzed the human rights situation from a range of violations. There are various differences that would require more time to go into detail, but I think one of the key things that we want to emphasize, and this is what I ended up on and we've reiterated throughout the report, is that where there is a human rights violation, it is the responsibility, the obligation of the state, and this applies in any country, to swiftly, effectively, and independently undertake an investigation to ensure that there is justice for the victim and that perpetrators are held to account. And this goes a long way to addressing the situation that we have, and we continue to find here the fact that there remains impunity for a number of violations and crimes that are committed.
Thank you. If there is no more questions, thank you.